For 9 years, I kept my uncle's $4 billion logistics empire running from the shadows while his golden child son took all the credit. I sacrificed my sleep, my youth, and my peace to repay a debt I never owed. But when they publicly fired me in front of Atlanta's elite, simply because I missed a birthday toast, I did not beg for my job. I just dropped my security badge into a glass of champagne and gave them a 23-minute warning. They thought they were getting rid of an employee. They had no idea they had just unplugged their entire empire. My name is Kiara and I am 32 years old. The heavy glass doors of the downtown Atlanta penthouse slid open, and the thumping bass of the rooftop DJ hit me like a physical wall. I stepped inside the lavish venue, pulling my wrinkled blazer tighter around my shoulders. I was exhausted. My feet throbbed inside my pumps, and my eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets and union contracts for the past 14 hours straight. While everyone else in this room had been sipping top-shelf liquor and celebrating my cousin DeAndre turning 34. I had been sitting in a sterile conference room across town, fighting to keep Vanguard Logistics from collapsing. A massive freight strike on the East Coast had threatened to sever our supply chain completely. If those drivers had walked off the job, Vanguard would have lost millions by sunrise and breached contracts with 3 major retail giants. I had negotiated tirelessly, leveraging every connection I had built over the last decade to broker a last-minute deal. I held that signed contract in my hand right now, rolled tightly into a cylinder. I had literally saved the company again. But as I navigated through the sea of custom suits and designer gowns, no one looked at me with gratitude. The penthouse was a monument to excess. Waitstaff circulated with trays of caviar and gold leaf desserts. Ice sculptures gleamed under the custom lighting. My uncle Elijah, the chief executive officer of Vanguard Logistics, had spared no expense for his only son. As I walked further into the main hall, the crowd parted slightly. People whispered as I passed. I knew how I looked. I was a stark contrast to the perfectly curated aesthetic of the evening. I was the worker bee interrupting the royal gathering. DeAndre was standing on a raised platform near the center of the room, surrounded by his sycophantic friends and board members. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit that cost more than my first car, holding a microphone in one hand and a crystal flute of champagne in the other. He had just finished giving a speech about his vision for the company now that he had been appointed vice president of operations. It was a title I had earned 10 times over. A title Uncle Elijah had promised me for years before handing it to his son on a silver platter. DeAndre spotted me approaching. His wide, charismatic smile vanished instantly, replaced by a deep scowl of annoyance. He lowered the microphone and stepped down from the platform, closing the distance between us. The music seemed to dip lower as if the DJ sensed the impending collision. The chatter of the elite crowd hushed. Hundreds of eyes turned to watch the family drama unfold. "Look who finally decided to show up!" DeAndre projected his voice, making sure it carried across the room. "I guess the director of supply chain operates on her own time zone now." I stopped a few feet away from him, fighting the urge to rub my aching temples. DeAndre. I was at the negotiating table with the freight union. I started keeping my voice level and professional. We were about to lose the entire Eastern Seaboard route. I just secured the signatures. The strike is called off. I held out the rolled-up contract, offering him the victory. I expected a nod of acknowledgement. I expected him to snatch the paper and take the credit as he always did. Instead, he swatted my hand away. The papers fell to the floor, landing on the polished marble tile. "Do you think I care about a union dispute right now?" DeAndre sneered, stepping closer. "Tonight is my night. Tonight is about celebrating my promotion and my birthday. And you embarrassed me. You disrespected the family hierarchy by missing the toast." He did not lower his voice. He wanted an audience. He wanted to assert his new dominance as vice president by making an example out of me. I looked at the contract on the floor and then back up at his arrogant face. "I saved your routing network, DeAndre. If I had left that table to come drink champagne, Vanguard would be bleeding cash by morning." My sister-in-law, Sarah, suddenly stepped out from the crowd to stand beside DeAndre. She was married to my younger brother Malik, who was standing a few paces behind her, looking utterly defeated. Sarah was a white woman who had married into our black family, purely for the proximity to wealth and status. She spent her days at the country club and her nights making sure Malik stayed perfectly compliant to Elijah's demands. She wore a diamond necklace that Malik had purchased using the bonus I had negotiated for him. "Oh, please, Kiara," Sarah said loudly, her voice dripping with that familiar condescending tone she always used with me. "Stop acting like you are the chief executive officer. You are just a glorified dispatcher anyway. DeAndre could have easily handled those drivers tomorrow. You just wanted to make a grand entrance and ruin the mood. You are always so angry and difficult." The racial microaggression hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. The angry black woman trope thrown in my face by someone who lived entirely off my unseen labor. I looked at Malik, hoping my brother would defend me. But Malik just stared at the floor, his shoulders hunched, terrified of jeopardizing his accounting job at the firm. I could not rely on him. I never could. I shifted my gaze past Sarah and DeAndre toward the VIP section. Uncle Elijah sat on a plush velvet sofa, separated from the common guests by a velvet rope. He was watching the entire exchange. Our eyes met. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, took a slow sip, and gave DeAndre a barely perceptible nod of approval. He was giving his son permission to execute me publicly. DeAndre caught the signal, and his chest puffed out with renewed authority. "You know what your problem is, Kiara," he said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "You forget your place. Dad took you and Malik out of the gutter when you were 12 years old. You had absolutely nothing. We fed you. We clothed you. We paid for your education. You owe us your life." I took a step closer, invading my personal space. The scent of expensive cologne and alcohol wafted off him. "But instead of showing gratitude, you walk in here looking like trash, undermining my authority in front of my guests. I am the vice president of operations now, and my first official act is cleaning house." He flicked his wrist. A splash of cold champagne flew from his glass and hit my shoes, soaking into the fabric of my trousers. The crowd gasped softly. Sarah smirked, crossing her arms over her chest. "You are fired, Kiara," DeAndre announced loudly, pointing a finger at my face. "Effective immediately. Hand over your security badge and get out of my building." The silence that followed was absolute. Everyone waited for my reaction. They expected me to crumble. They expected me to cry or beg or remind them of my loyalty. For 9 years, I had sacrificed my personal life, my holidays, and my sanity for Vanguard Logistics. I had built the supply chain algorithms they currently used. I had negotiated the vendor rates that made them billionaires. I was the ghost in the machine, keeping their empire running perfectly while they took all the praise. And this was my severance package: a public firing at a birthday party. I looked at the champagne dripping from my trousers. I looked at Sarah's triumphant smile. I looked at my brother Malik, who was too cowardly to meet my eyes. And finally, I looked at Uncle Elijah, who was watching me with cold calculation, expecting me to break. But I did not break. The fear and exhaustion that had plagued me for years simply evaporated, leaving behind a terrifying sense of absolute clarity. They had just handed me the keys to my own freedom. They thought they held all the power because they owned the corporate title. They had no idea I owned the actual infrastructure. I reached up to the lapel of my blazer. My fingers brushed the hard plastic of the Vanguard Logistics security badge. I unclipped it smoothly. I did not throw it. I did not hand it to him. I took one step forward, holding the badge over DeAndre's half-full champagne glass. I opened my fingers and let it drop. The badge splashed into the expensive liquor, sinking to the bottom with a quiet clink. DeAndre stared at the glass in shock, his mouth falling slightly open. "You are right, DeAndre," I said, my voice dropping to a conversational volume that forced him to lean in to hear me. "I am just a glorified dispatcher. And since I am no longer an employee, I will be taking my personal property with me." I lifted my left arm and tapped the face of my watch. I looked him dead in the eyes. "It is exactly 9:42 in the evening. You have exactly 23 minutes before every single supplier on the East Coast halts delivery. Every truck will stop. Every routing server will go dark." DeAndre scoffed, trying to recover his bravado. "What are you talking about, you crazy woman? You do not control the trucks. The company does." I offered him a small, chilling smile. Tell your dad I said good luck. I turned on my heel and began walking toward the exit. The crowd parted for me instantly, no longer whispering, just staring in stunned silence. I kept my back straight, my head high and my pace steady. I did not look back at the VIP section. I did not look back at my brother. I walked straight out the heavy glass doors and pressed the button for the elevator. As the metal doors slid open, I heard a sudden commotion erupt from the penthouse behind me. It started as a low murmur and quickly escalated into a chaotic symphony of notification chimes. The lights of DeAndre's phone and every executive phone in that room had just begun to flash simultaneously with emergency alerts. The automated breach protocols were triggering. I stepped into the elevator, and the doors closed, shutting out the noise of their panic. I watched the floor numbers count down as I descended to the street level. My chest felt lighter than it had in a decade. They had demanded my resignation. They had humiliated me for their own entertainment. But they had forgotten the most important rule of business. Never fire the person who holds the keys to the kingdom without changing the locks first. I walked out into the cool Atlanta night air, breathing deeply. The countdown had started, and my revenge was going to be flawless. I stepped out of the luxury high-rise and let the cool Atlanta breeze wash over my face. Behind me, the building was already buzzing with panic, but I just adjusted my blazer and walked 2 blocks down the street to a 24-hour diner I frequented. The neon sign buzzed overhead, casting a red glow on the pavement. I walked inside, slid into a worn vinyl booth at the back, and greeted the waitress. I ordered a plate of Belgian waffles with extra syrup and a large black coffee. I opened my laptop and placed it on the table. The screen illuminated my face, showing the live dashboard of Vanguard Logistics. I watched the clock in the corner of my screen. It was 9:58. I had 9 minutes left before the empire my uncle built on my back came crashing down. For 9 years, I had been the silent architect of their wealth. I designed the proprietary routing software that coordinated 10,000 truck drivers nationwide. It was a flawless system that optimized fuel routes, delivery times, and driver schedules, saving the company billions. Uncle Elijah loved the profit, but he hated acknowledging where it came from. He always made sure DeAndre got the official credit in every board meeting and press release. They thought the software belonged to the company just because I built it while sitting at my desk. They never bothered to read the fine print of the licensing agreement. The waitress set my coffee and waffles down on the table. I thanked her and poured the syrup over the warm waffles, taking a slow, deliberate bite. The coffee was hot and bitter, a perfect contrast to the sweet syrup. I looked back at my screen. 10:04. 60 seconds left. I opened the back-end portal of my software. The system was currently processing over 3,000 active routes across the eastern seaboard. Trucks carrying perishable goods, high-value electronics, and critical medical supplies were all navigating through the dark, using my algorithms. DeAndre thought firing me was a simple flex of his new authority. He truly believed I was just a dispatcher answering phones and moving pins on a map. He did not realize I owned the map. 10:05. The countdown hit 0. I pressed a single key on my laptop. Instantly, the live dashboard went pitch black. The thousands of green dots representing active trucks vanished from the map. The routing servers shut down completely. The automated dispatch system disconnected. Every single driver currently on the road just lost their GPS navigation, their delivery schedules, and their warehouse access codes. The entire supply chain of Vanguard Logistics was now effectively blind, deaf, and paralyzed. I took another sip of my coffee. Less than 2 minutes later, my phone began to vibrate violently against the Formica table. The caller identification showed DeAndre. I let it ring. It stopped, then immediately started ringing again. I waited for the third call before I finally swiped the screen and placed the phone on the table, activating the speakerphone. Kiara, what the hell did you just do? DeAndre screamed so loudly, the phone speaker distorted his voice. The background noise on his end was chaotic. I could hear people shouting and the distinct sound of alarms blaring in the penthouse. I am currently eating a waffle, DeAndre, I replied, keeping my voice entirely flat and conversational. I highly recommend the diner on 5th Street. The syrup is excellent. Turn the system back on right now! DeAndre yelled, his voice cracking with panic. Every single monitor in the operations center just went black. The drivers are calling in saying their tablets are locked out. We have 300 trucks approaching the Atlanta hub, and they cannot get past the security gates because the automated clearance system is down. What did you do to the servers? I did not do anything to the servers, I said, cutting a piece of waffle with my fork. I simply terminated my independent software license. You fired me, remember? I am no longer an employee of Vanguard Logistics. Therefore, Vanguard Logistics no longer has authorization to utilize my proprietary routing algorithm. I believe I warned you about this 23 minutes ago. You do not own that software. Kiara, he fired back, the arrogance returning to his voice despite the panic. You built it while working for us. That is company property. You are committing corporate sabotage, and I will have you arrested before midnight. Turn it back on, or I am calling the police. I leaned back in the booth and smiled at the empty diner. Go ahead and call them, DeAndre. But before you accuse me of sabotage, you might want to ask your legal department to read every agreement governing the routing platform. There is a reason the system went dark the moment my termination became effective, and there is a reason your credentials no longer work. I am not explaining the structure to you over the phone. You wanted me out of Vanguard. Now your lawyers can explain what that decision actually cost you. The line went dead quiet for a few seconds. I could hear the heavy breathing on the other end as his brain struggled to catch up to the reality of the situation. DeAndre had never bothered to learn how the technical side of the business operated. He spent his days playing golf with clients and taking long lunches while I managed the infrastructure. You are lying, he finally said, but his voice was trembling now. Dad said our internal tech team manages the routing servers. We do not use third-party software for our core operations. You do not have an internal tech team capable of running this network, I corrected him softly. You just had me. I was the tech team. I was the routing server. I was the entire supply chain. And you just fired me because I was 30 minutes late to watch you drink champagne. Kiara, listen to me, DeAndre said, trying to lower his voice and adopt a more authoritative tone. This is not a game. We have perishable goods sitting on loading docks in Florida. We have medical supplies that need to reach hospitals in New York by sunrise. If those trucks do not move, we are going to face millions in breach of contract penalties by tomorrow morning. You need to log back in and fix this glitch immediately. It is not a glitch, DeAndre. It is a consequence, and it is no longer my problem. I watched my laptop screen as I spoke. I had a separate window open tracking the after-hours stock market. Vanguard Logistics was a publicly traded company, and news traveled fast in the corporate world. It had only been 15 minutes since the system went down, but rumors of a massive supply chain failure were already hitting the financial forums. The stock price was beginning to dip a slow downward trajectory that would become a freefall by the time the opening bell rang tomorrow morning. If you do not fix this right now, DeAndre snarled, dropping the professional act entirely, I will make sure you never work in this industry again. I will withhold your final paycheck. I will cancel your health insurance tonight. You will be out on the street begging for scraps just like you were before my dad took you in. You are nothing without this family, Kiara. Nothing. The threat was so predictable it almost made me laugh. They always reverted to the same tactic, reminding me of my childhood poverty, trying to use my trauma as a weapon to keep me compliant. They truly believed I was still that terrified 12-year-old girl desperate for a roof over her head. Keep the paycheck. DeAndre, I said, picking up my coffee cup. Consider it a parting gift. You are going to need every spare dollar to pay the breach of contract settlements tomorrow. Oh, and one more thing. What, he snapped. Happy birthday. I tapped the screen, ending the call. I sat in the quiet, finishing my meal, while my phone continued to light up with calls and text messages from various Vanguard executives. I ignored all of them. For years, I had jumped at every notification, sacrificed my sleep for every emergency, and fixed every mistake DeAndre made. That version of me was dead. I signaled the waitress, asked for the check, and paid with a generous tip. As I walked out of the diner and into the cool night air, I felt a profound sense of peace. The hardest part was over. The chain had been cut, but I knew my Uncle Elijah would not take this lying down without a massive fight. I unlocked my car and slid into the seat. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. Tomorrow the war would begin. I drove back to my apartment with the windows rolled down, letting the cool, early morning air fill the car. The streets of Atlanta were empty and quiet, a stark contrast to the absolute chaos I knew was unfolding at the Vanguard Logistics headquarters. By the time I walked through my front door, it was past 3 in the morning. I did not bother turning on the main lights. I just kicked off my ruined shoes, the ones stained with DeAndre's champagne, and left my blazer draped over the back of a dining chair. I opened my laptop again and set it on the kitchen island, watching the global financial markets. Vanguard stock had already taken a massive hit in the overseas trading markets, and the domestic opening bell was still hours away. The trucking forums were exploding with confused drivers stranded at way stations and loading docks across the eastern seaboard. The digital blackout was total and absolute. I brewed a pot of tea, took a hot shower, and changed into comfortable sweatpants. I felt no guilt. I felt no panic. For the first time since I was a 12-year-old girl standing in a funeral home clutching my little brother Malik by the hand, I felt entirely in control of my own destiny. I sat by the window, watching the sky slowly turn from pitch black to a bruised purple as the sun prepared to rise. I knew they would not wait long. DeAndre was arrogant and foolish, but my uncle Elijah was a predator. He built a $4 billion empire by recognizing threats and crushing them before they could multiply. I knew he would not send lawyers first. He would try to handle me the same way he always had, by using his overwhelming physical and psychological presence to force me into submission. I just did not expect him to bypass my building security. At exactly 6 in the morning, heavy aggressive pounding shook my front door. It was not a polite knock. It was the sound of a man who believed he owned everything on the other side of the wood. I set my teacup down on the counter, walked over to the door, and checked the peephole. Uncle Elijah was standing in the hallway. He was not wearing his usual immaculate tailored suit. He wore dark slacks and an expensive cashmere overcoat thrown hastily over a dress shirt without a tie. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see a muscle feathering under his skin. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. I did not say a word. I did not greet him. I just stood in the doorway looking at the man who had demanded my absolute loyalty while handing my achievements to his incompetent son. Elijah did not wait for an invitation. He pushed past me, brushing my shoulder roughly, and stepped right into my living room. He looked around my modest apartment, taking in the simple furniture and the stack of supply chain textbooks on the coffee table. He looked entirely out of place, a billionaire standing in the home of the worker bee he had created. "Fix it," he demanded, turning to face me. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that usually commanded immediate obedience from everyone in the boardroom. He did not yell. He did not need to. The quiet menace in his tone was meant to intimidate me. I closed the front door slowly, making sure the lock clicked into place. "Fix what, Uncle Elijah?" I asked, walking past him into the kitchen. "Would you like some tea? I just brewed a fresh pot." "Do not play games with me, Kiara," he snapped, taking a heavy step toward the kitchen counter. "You know exactly why I am here. DeAndre told me what you did to the routing servers. You are going to open that laptop right now, log into the network, and restore the system. We have 500 trucks sitting idle at the state borders, and 2 major retail clients threatening to pull their contracts by noon if we do not provide delivery estimates. You are going to fix the glitch, and then we are going to have a very long conversation about your insubordination." I poured myself another cup of tea, leaning against the counter. I blew on the hot liquid, watching the steam rise. "It is not a glitch," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm. "And I cannot restore the system, because I do not work for Vanguard Logistics anymore." DeAndre fired me in front of 200 people. He revoked my security clearance and demanded my badge. "I am legally an independent citizen now. I have zero obligation to help your company function." Elijah slammed his hand down on the granite countertop, making my teacup rattle. "DeAndre is an idiot," he growled, his eyes narrowing into cold, dark slits. "He was drunk, and he overstepped his authority. I am the chief executive officer of this company, and I am telling you that you are not fired. You are going to fix the network, and you are going to do it right now because I command it. You work for me, Kiara. You have always worked for me. I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, without the lens of familial obligation. I saw the greed sweating out of his pores. I saw the desperation hiding behind his anger. He was terrified. For a decade, he had convinced himself that his brilliance was the reason the company grew from a mid-sized freight broker to an international logistics titan. He had completely ignored the fact that my algorithms were the only reason his trucks ran on time. Now the reality was staring him in the face, and he hated me for it. "I do not work for you anymore, Uncle Elijah," I said, taking a slow sip of my tea. "And even if you decide DeAndre had no authority to fire me, you cannot order me to restore access, as if nothing happened." Vanguard's right to use the routing platform ended when my employment was terminated without a transition. Your trucks and warehouses are yours. The system coordinating them is governed by agreements your legal department has ignored for years. Read what you signed. Until then, you are trespassing on my time and my property." Elijah stared at me, and the corporate mask finally slipped completely off his face. The distinguished uncle, the generous patriarch, the wealthy savior who took in his orphaned niece and nephew vanished. What stood before me was the ruthless opportunist who saw everyone as a transaction. He took another step toward me, his massive frame towering over my kitchen island. "You ungrateful little brat," he hissed, his voice dropping to a vicious whisper. "You think you are smart because you filed some paperwork behind my back. You think you can hold my company hostage. You forget who you are talking to. I fed you, Kiara. I clothed you. When your parents died with nothing but debt to their names, I took you and Malik out of the gutter. I put a roof over your head. I paid for your college tuition. Everything you know about logistics, you learned while sitting in my building, eating my food and spending my money. Your brain belongs to Vanguard. You owe me every thought in your head." The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. For years I had internalized that exact narrative. I had let him convince me that my intelligence was just a return on his investment. I had worked 80-hour weeks, missed holidays, and sacrificed my youth because I felt an insurmountable debt of gratitude. But hearing him say it out loud, stripping away the illusion of family love and replacing it with ownership, broke the final chain around my neck. "He never loved us. We were just cheap labor. We were an acquisition. I paid you back 100 times over," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I built the infrastructure that made you a billionaire. I fixed every mistake your son made so the board would not vote him out. I gave you my life. But you got greedy. You wanted the crown for DeAndre, and you wanted me to stay in the shadows forever. You fired the only person who knew how the engine worked. That is a bad business decision, Uncle Elijah. And in business, bad decisions cost money." Elijah stood completely still for a moment. He realized that intimidation was not working. The old buttons he used to press the guilt, the shame, the fear of abandonment were all disconnected. So he did what any cornered predator does. He pivoted to a softer target. He smiled, a slow, cruel twisting of his lips that made my stomach tighten. "You are right," he said softly. "Business is business. And you have made a very bold move. But you are forgetting one crucial detail, Kiara. You are not the only orphan I took in." I set my teacup down. I kept my face blank, but my heart rate accelerated slightly. "Your brother Malik." Elijah continued, pacing slowly around the kitchen island. "He is a senior accountant in my finance department. He makes a very comfortable 6-figure salary. He has full health benefits, a matching retirement plan, and a very expensive lifestyle to maintain. His lovely wife Sarah has quite the taste for luxury, does she not? She loves her country club memberships and her designer bags. They just bought that beautiful house in Buckhead with a mortgage they can barely afford." "Leave Malik out of this," I warned, my voice dropping lower. "He has nothing to do with the software or my termination." "I has everything to do with it," Elijah countered, his smile widening into something genuinely sinister. "Because if you do not log into that computer and restore my routing network within the next 10 minutes, I am going to fire Malik. I am going to terminate his employment effective immediately. I will pull his severance package. I will make sure his stock options are frozen. And then I am going to make a few phone calls to my friends in the financial sector and ensure he never works as an accountant in the state of Georgia ever again." He leaned over the counter, placing both hands on the granite, staring directly into my eyes. I will bankrupt your brother Kiara. I will take his house. I will take his cars. I will ruin his life. And when Sarah leaves him because the money dries up his broken family, will be entirely your fault. Because you wanted to throw a tantrum over a birthday party. The threat was methodical and vicious. Elijah knew exactly how to find the weak point in my armor. I had spent my entire life protecting Malik, making sure he had the normal life we were robbed of when our parents died. Elijah was betting his entire empire on my maternal instinct toward my younger brother. He expected me to shatter to beg for mercy and to open my laptop to save Malik. I looked at my uncle. I looked at the man who was willing to destroy his own nephew to save his profit margins. I felt a surge of absolute disgust, but I did not let it show on my face. I had anticipated this exact maneuver. I had planned for it. I knew Elijah would weaponize Malik, and I knew Malik was currently too brainwashed by Sarah and the corporate perks to stand up for himself. I had to play this perfectly. I picked up my teacup, took a final sip, and looked Elijah dead in the eyes. "Fire him," I said smoothly. Elijah blinked, his confident smile faltering for a split second. "What did you say?" I said, "Fire him," I repeated, crossing my arms over my chest. "Terminate his contract, blacklist him, do whatever you feel is necessary for your company. Malik is a grown man, and his employment status is between him and human resources. It has absolutely zero bearing on my software licenses. I am not turning the servers back on Uncle Elijah. Not for you, not for DeAndre, and certainly not for a hostage negotiation involving my brother." Elijah stared at me, his chest heaving as he struggled to comprehend my response. He had fired his best weapon, and I had not even flinched. The realization that he had completely lost control of the situation finally washed over his face, leaving him looking old and desperate. "You are a monster," he whispered, stepping back from the counter. "You would destroy your own brother out of spite." I walked over to the front door and pulled it open, gesturing toward the hallway. "You are projecting, Uncle Elijah. Now please leave my apartment before I call building security and have you escorted out for trespassing. I have a very busy day ahead of me, and you have a logistics empire to explain to your shareholders." Elijah stood in the kitchen for a long moment, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked from me to the closed laptop on the table and back again. Without another word, he stormed past me, his heavy overcoat brushing against the doorframe. I slammed the door behind him and locked the deadbolt. I leaned against the heavy wood, taking a deep breath to steady my racing heart. I had just thrown my brother to the wolves, but it was the only way to force Malik to finally see the truth about our family. The trap was set, and I knew Sarah would be the next one to call. I stood in the silence of my apartment, listening to the heavy footsteps of my uncle fading down the hallway. He was gone, but the toxic energy he brought into my home lingered in the air. I walked back to the kitchen and poured the rest of my tea down the sink. The liquid swirled down the drain, much like the illusion of my family loyalty. Elijah thought he had me cornered. He thought threatening my brother Malik would break my resolve and force me back into submission. He relied on my history of protecting Malik. Ever since our parents passed away, I had been the shield standing between my younger brother and the harsh realities of the world. Elijah knew this, and he weaponized it. But he fundamentally misunderstood the situation. I was not abandoning Malik. I was forcing him to wake up. For years, Malik had allowed himself to be controlled by two things. The first was his fear of our uncle. The second was his marriage to Sarah. I walked over to the living room window and looked out at the morning traffic slowly building on the streets below. Sarah was a white woman who had married into our black family with very specific intentions. She saw Malik as a ticket to a lifestyle she felt she deserved but could not afford on her own. She loved the corporate perks, the luxury vehicles, and the status that came with the Vanguard Logistics name. She tolerated me only because my silent labor kept the money flowing into her bank accounts. She smiled at family dinners and posted performative photos online, but behind closed doors, her racial microaggressions and sheer entitlement were suffocating. Malik chose to ignore her toxic behavior to keep the peace. I knew Elijah calling Malik to threaten his job would send Sarah into an absolute frenzy. My phone began to vibrate on the kitchen island. I did not need to look at the screen to know who was calling. I walked over and stared at the glowing display. It was Sarah. The timing was almost too perfect. Elijah must have called them the second he stepped out of my building. I let the phone ring, watching it vibrate against the granite countertop. I wanted her to sit in her anxiety for a moment. I wanted her to feel a fraction of the panic I had managed for the past 9 years. When the ringing stopped, it immediately started again. I picked up the phone and swiped the screen to answer, placing it on speaker mode. Before I could even say a word, Sarah started screaming. Her voice was shrill and borderline hysterical. "Kiara, what is wrong with you?" she yelled, her breath hitching as if she had been crying. "Malik just got off the phone with your uncle Elijah. He said you sabotaged the company's servers, and now Elijah is threatening to terminate Malik. Do you have any idea what you have done? You are going to ruin our lives because you threw a tantrum over a stupid birthday party." I leaned against the counter and listened to her unravel. I did not interrupt. I let her reveal exactly who she was. "We have a mortgage, Kiara." Sarah continued, her voice climbing higher in pitch. "We just paid the initiation fees for the country club. Malik is supposed to close on my new car next week. If he loses his job, we lose everything. How could you be so incredibly selfish? You know how hard Malik works for this family. You know what we have on the line. But you always have to make everything about you. You always have to be the angry black woman causing a scene and making things difficult for everyone else." There it was. The mask completely slipped off. When her financial security was threatened, she immediately resorted to racist tropes to invalidate my emotions. I was not a professional who had been wrongfully terminated and humiliated. In her eyes, I was just an angry black woman, disrupting her comfortable white country club life. "Are you finished, Sarah?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously calm and completely devoid of emotion. "No, I am not finished," she snapped, her breathing ragged. "You need to call Elijah right now. You need to apologize for whatever stunt you pulled at the gala last night, and you need to fix the computer system. You owe this to Malik. You owe this to us. You are going to call your uncle and beg for your job back, so my husband does not suffer the consequences of your psychotic behavior." I picked up the phone and turned off the speaker function, pressing the device to my ear. I wanted her to hear every single syllable clearly. "Let us get a few things straight, Sarah," I said, my tone dropping to a whisper that commanded silence. "First, I did not sabotage the servers. I own the software that runs Vanguard Logistics, and I revoked their license because DeAndre publicly fired me. Second, I do not owe you or Malik anything. I spent the last 9 years working 80-hour weeks to secure the bonuses that paid for your designer bags and your luxury vacations. You have been living off my unseen labor since the day you married my brother." "That is a lie," Sarah sputtered, but her voice lacked conviction. "Malik earned that money. He is a senior accountant." "Malik is a pawn," I corrected her coldly. "Elijah keeps him around to control me, and you keep him around to fund your lifestyle. Neither of you actually cares about his well-being. You just proved that right now. Your husband is facing termination, and instead of supporting him or asking how he is holding up, you are crying about your country club fees and your new car. You do not love my brother Sarah. You love his proximity to a billionaire." "How dare you," she hissed. "You people are all the same. You get a little bit of power and you use it to tear down the people who actually try to build a decent life. You are just jealous because I have a real family and a real marriage, and you have nothing but your computers and your bitter attitude." I closed my eyes for a brief second, taking in the sheer audacity of her statement. "You people." The words echoed in my mind. She was so desperate to maintain her illusion of superiority that she was willing to burn every bridge. "I am not jealous of your marriage, Sarah," I replied. "I pity my brother for being tied to a parasite. And as for my power, you have not even begun to see what I am capable of. I will not apologize to Elijah. I will not turn the servers back on. And I will not protect your fragile little lifestyle anymore. The free ride is officially over." "You cannot do this, Kiara." Sarah pleaded, her anger suddenly giving way to desperation as she realized I was entirely serious. "Please, if Malik loses his job, we will go bankrupt. We do not have savings. We spent everything on the house down payment. You cannot just abandon your own brother like this." "I am not abandoning him," I said. "I am giving him a choice. He can continue to be a hostage to Elijah and a bank account for you, or he can finally stand up and be a man. That is his decision to make. But I am no longer shielding either of you from the consequences of this toxic family dynamic." "You are a monster," Sarah whispered. No, Sarah, I am a businesswoman, I countered. And right now, you and Elijah are learning a very hard lesson about supply and demand. You demanded my absolute submission, and I cut off your supply of my genius. It is basic economics. I could hear Malik in the background on her end of the line. His voice was muffled, asking her who she was talking to and telling her to calm down. She ignored him completely, too focused on trying to bully me into submission. I am going to drive over there right now, Sarah threatened. I am going to come to your apartment and we are going to sort this out face to face. You are not going to ignore me, Kiara. I will not let you ruin my life. I smiled, though she could not see it. The pieces were falling into place exactly as I had anticipated. Sarah was predictable. Her greed made her easy to manipulate. I knew she would try to play the peacemaker in person, hoping she could guilt me or trick me into surrendering the software access. She thought she was smarter than me. She thought she could outmaneuver the angry black woman. You can come over if you want, Sarah, I said, keeping my voice light and detached. I am not going to argue about my employment or my property over the phone. If you think you can change my mind, come say it to my face. But understand something before you leave your house. I am done fixing this family's mistakes, and I am done being manipulated through Malik. Sarah snapped that she was already grabbing her keys and would be at my apartment within the hour. I told her she knew the address and waited while she tried to throw one more insult at me. I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the screen to end the call, cutting off whatever insult she was about to hurl at me. I placed the phone face down on the kitchen island and walked over to my desk. I opened a locked drawer and pulled out a silver flash drive. It was small, unassuming, and completely lethal. The silver drive was part of a contingency Terrence and I had prepared long before this morning. I checked it once and closed the utility window before any technical details could remain visible on the screen. What mattered was not forcing anyone into a mistake. If Sarah touched my computer or took anything from my apartment, it had to be her decision and her decision alone. On my laptop, I opened a folder labeled Master Routing Source and left the window visible on the desktop. I placed the silver flash drive beside the computer where anyone entering the room would notice it immediately. I did not send Sarah a file. I did not ask her to copy anything. I simply created an opportunity and trusted her desperation to decide the rest. I adjusted the laptop so the folder name could be read from the sofa and left the drive within easy reach. The arrangement looked careless enough to be believable without looking staged. For the first time that morning, I stopped predicting Sarah's next sentence. I only needed to watch what she chose to do when she thought nobody was watching. I walked into my bathroom and turned on the cold water, splashing it onto my face to wash away the lingering exhaustion of the night. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, taking a deep breath. The family thought they had broken me by firing me, and that threatening Malik would force my surrender. They still believed every crisis ended with me fixing their mistakes. This time, I was not fixing anything for them. I dried my face and returned to the living room. The laptop was open. The silver drive was beside it. I sat on the sofa and waited. My phone buzzed again, breaking the silence of my apartment. This time, the caller identification did not display a frantic family member looking to hurl insults or demand my submission. It was Terrence. Terrence was a high-powered corporate attorney and the only person in Atlanta who knew the full extent of my safety net. He was a brilliant black man who had navigated the treacherous waters of corporate law with predatory precision. Over the years, he had been my mentor, my legal shield, and my silent partner in this long game against my uncle. I answered the call and placed the phone on the coffee table, switching on the speaker. "Good morning, Terrence," I said, leaning back into the cushions and stretching my legs. "Tell me the cancellation notice was fully executed." "It was delivered and legally binding the very second DeAndre publicly terminated your employment," Terrence replied, his deep voice rumbling with quiet satisfaction. "I have the digital delivery receipts from the Vanguard legal department and the automated server logs. They are officially locked out of the network, and any attempt to bypass the block constitutes a federal cybercrime. How are you holding up, Kiara?" "I am drinking tea and waiting for Sarah to walk into my trap," I told him, staring at the silver flash drive resting near my laptop. Uncle Elijah came to my door at dawn. He threatened to fire Malik and bankrupt his family if I did not fix what he is still arrogantly calling a glitch. A glitch Terrence chuckled softly, the sound carrying a wealth of professional amusement. Elijah always was a man blinded by his own massive ego. He still cannot fathom that the little niece he treated like a stray dog actually owns the infrastructure of his entire empire. We need to make sure the patent documentation is absolutely impenetrable, Terrence, I said, feeling a familiar surge of protective adrenaline. Elijah is a cornered predator right now. He is going to throw every high-priced litigator he has at us by tomorrow morning. He will try to claim corporate ownership of the software. Your intellectual property is bulletproof, Kiara Terrence assured me, his tone shifting into absolute legal certainty. We made sure of that 9 years ago. Do you remember the day you came into my office with those initial blueprints crying because your uncle had humiliated you? I remembered it like it was yesterday. I was 23 years old, fresh out of college, and working 90-hour weeks in the Vanguard Dispatch Center. I was drowning in the sheer volume of logistical nightmares the company faced daily. I had spent 6 unpaid months developing a dynamic routing algorithm that could cut fuel costs by 20% and optimize driver schedules in real time. I compiled a massive presentation detailing the financial benefits and took it directly to Uncle Elijah, hoping to finally earn his respect and a proper position in the executive hierarchy. I remembered standing in his lavish corner office, smelling the heavy scent of his expensive cigars. I laid out the projected profits, showing him exactly how my code could revolutionize his shipping routes. Elijah barely looked at the pages. He tossed the folder back across his massive mahogany desk and laughed directly in my face. He called my software absolute garbage. He told me that logistics was a man's game built on handshake deals and warehouse grit, not fancy computer tricks, designed by a little girl who should just be grateful to have a job answering his phones. He refused to fund a single cent of the development and told me to get back to the dispatch floor before he replaced me. I walked straight from his office to yours, Terrence. I said, the memory still carrying a faint sting of old betrayal. I was crying because I thought I was worthless. I thought my brain was broken because my own uncle told me I had no value beyond cheap labor. And I told you to stop crying and start building, Terrence reminded me gently. I told you that when someone refuses to give you a seat at the table, you do not beg them for a chair. You build your own table, and you make them pay for the privilege to sit at it. That was the day everything changed for me. With Terrence guiding me through the legal labyrinth, we established an independent limited liability company called Meridian Freight Solutions. I used every penny of my meager savings and maxed out 3 separate credit cards to finish the software development on my own time, using my own personal equipment. I filed the patents under Meridian, establishing undeniable independent ownership. Vanguard Logistics had absolutely no legal claim to my intellectual property because Elijah had explicitly rejected it in writing when he called it garbage. But the real genius was how we integrated it into Vanguard. I told Terrence, tracing the edge of my coffee table with my index finger. When the company started losing millions due to inefficient routing the following year, Elijah panicked. He demanded his operations department find a cheap third-party solution to stop the financial bleeding. He was too arrogant to review the vendor contracts himself. He just wanted the problem fixed so he could continue living his lavish lifestyle. Terrence, who was doing external contract consulting for Vanguard at the time, slipped the Meridian Freight Solutions licensing agreement into a thick stack of routine vendor renewals. Elijah signed the paperwork without ever realizing that Meridian was completely owned and operated by his scapegoat niece. For the past 8 years, Vanguard Logistics had been leasing my software on a simple 30-day rolling contract. It was a standard vendor agreement, but Terrence had expertly drafted a specific immediate termination clause. The clause stated that the license would be instantly revoked if the primary account manager, which was me, was ever removed from her position at Vanguard without a 90-day transition period. DeAndre firing me at his birthday gala was not just a public insult. It was the legal trigger that completely invalidated their enterprise license. By terminating me effective immediately, DeAndre had legally stripped his own company of the software that kept his trucks moving. The beauty of it is the absolute legality, Terrence said, snapping me back to the present. They cannot claim you built it on company time because we have the time-stamped patent filings proving you developed it prior to the vendor agreement. They cannot claim corporate ownership because Elijah personally signed the third-party vendor lease acknowledging Meridian as an external entity. You own the brain of Vanguard Logistics, Kiara. And right now, that brain is completely disconnected from the corporate body. Sarah is on her way here, I reminded him, shifting my focus back to the immediate conflict. Elijah and DeAndre are desperate. They know they cannot fix the code themselves, and they know they cannot replace the software without halting operations for months. So they are going to try to steal it. You left the drive where she can see it, Terrence asked, his voice sharpening immediately. It is beside the laptop, I said. The screen is open to the folder she will assume contains everything Vanguard needs. I am not going to offer it to her, and I am not going to tell her to touch it. If she came here to negotiate, she can negotiate. If she came here for something else, she will have to make that choice herself. Good, Terrence said. Do not guide her, and do not block her once she reveals her intent. Preserve the timing of everything. People become careless when they believe money and status are slipping away from them, and Sarah has already shown you exactly what she values. I understand, I replied. I have spent my entire life cleaning up this family's messes. Today I am only going to watch. Whatever happens in this apartment has to come from Sarah, not from me. Then call me the second she leaves, Terrence said. Save every recording you lawfully control and do not alter a single file afterward. We can decide the next legal move from evidence instead of predictions. I thanked him and ended the call. I sat in the quiet of my living room, listening to the distant sounds of city traffic outside my window. The history between my uncle and me had always been defined by his power and my submission. He called my work garbage because he could not stand the idea of relying on the niece he viewed as a charity case. His massive ego had blinded him to the most basic rule of logistics. You never hand over the steering wheel without knowing how to drive the truck. Now Sarah was coming to my apartment to execute a theft she believed would save her luxurious life. She was walking directly into a trap designed to expose her greed and trigger the federal downfall of my uncle's empire. I leaned back against the sofa and took a deep breath. I was ready for the golden child's wife to make her move. The sharp knock at my front door echoed through the quiet apartment. I did not move from the sofa immediately. I let the sound linger in the air while I took a slow, deep breath. I knew exactly who was standing in the hallway. Sarah had always been predictable. Her greed made her easy to read, and her entitlement made her reckless. I stood up and smoothed the fabric of my sweatpants, walking deliberately toward the door. I checked the peephole. Sarah was standing there, holding a pink bakery box from that overpriced pastry shop she loved in Buckhead. She was wearing her pristine tennis clothes, looking like she had just stepped off the court for a casual morning visit. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Sarah pasted a bright artificial smile on her face the moment she saw me. Kiara, she said, her voice dripping with a forced sweetness that made my stomach turn. I brought you some blueberry muffins. I know we had a tense phone call earlier, and I just wanted to come over so we could talk things through face to face like family. I looked at this pink box, and then up at her carefully contoured face. Her eyes were darting nervously around my living room looking for my computer. I stepped aside and gestured for her to come in. She breezed past me, bringing the smell of expensive floral perfume into my space. She set the bakery box on my kitchen island and turned to face me with a dramatic sigh. I closed the door and leaned against it, watching her performance begin. I knew she was here for one specific reason, and it was not to mend fences or eat muffins. She desperately wanted my routing software today, right now. I walked over to the living room and sat down on the sofa, crossing my arms. I did not offer her a drink or a seat. I just waited for her to fill the silence. Sarah shifted her weight uncomfortably and ran a hand through her blonde hair. She looked at the coffee table where my personal laptop sat closed right next to the small silver flash drive. I saw her eyes lock onto the drive for a fraction of a second before she forced herself to look back at me. I am sorry about what happened at the party last night, she said, her tone entirely unconvincing. DeAndre can be so hot-headed sometimes, but you know he does not mean half the things he says. He is just under a lot of pressure with his new promotion, and you have to admit, You being late was a little disrespectful to the family. I kept my face perfectly blank. Disrespectful, I repeated softly, testing the word. I saved a vital shipping contract that keeps your husband employed. But you think my lack of punctuality is the real crime here. Sarah sighed heavily, taking a few steps closer to the sofa. You are always so defensive, Kiara. You always take everything as a personal attack. We are your family. We love you and we want you to succeed, but you have to learn how to play on a team. You cannot just shut down the entire logistics network because your feelings got hurt. People are relying on you. Malik is relying on you. She was trying to weaponize my brother again, trying to make me feel guilty for defending my own boundaries. I let her continue her speech knowing every word was a calculated manipulation. It was completely, utterly pathetic. Malik is terrified right now, Kiara, she said, stepping closer until she was hovering only a few feet from the coffee table. Elijah is furious, and he is threatening to pull all of our benefits. We have a life to maintain, and you are putting all of that at risk. I know you feel underappreciated, but you have to look at the bigger picture. You women always let your emotions cloud your professional judgment. I need you to be reasonable for once. Give me the access codes to the routing software. Let me take them back to Elijah and tell him you are sorry. I can smooth this over for you. I can save your job and save my husband from being fired. Just do the right thing for your family. The condescension in her words was suffocating. She genuinely believed I would trade ownership of my work for her approval. I let my gaze. The laptop screen still showed the folder labeled Master Routing Source, and the silver drive sat beside it. I needed no speech from Sarah. I needed a choice. I slumped my shoulders and let exhaustion enter my voice. I am just so tired, Sarah, I whispered, letting my voice crack. I worked so hard for them for 9 years and they treated me like garbage in front of the entire city. I just wanted them to admit that I built the master routing files sitting right there on that laptop. Sarah followed my eyes to the screen. I saw her attention lock on the folder name, and then flick to the silver drive beside the keyboard. You did build it, Kiara, she said in a fake, soothing tone. You deserve to be recognized. If you let me take a copy to Elijah, I can make him understand. I can get your job back with a proper title. Just let me handle the men. I put my head in my hands, hiding the smile threatening to form. I cannot do this right now, Sarah, I mumbled. My head is spinning. I need to wash my face and breathe for a minute. Do not touch anything while I am gone. I stood and walked toward the bathroom, leaving the unlocked laptop and the silver drive in plain sight. I stepped into the bathroom and pushed the door almost shut, leaving a narrow crack. From the mirror, I could see enough of the living room to watch without moving. Sarah waited only a few seconds. The caring sister-in-law disappeared from her face. She rushed to the coffee table and opened the laptop wider. The folder labeled Master Routing Source was already on the screen. She glanced toward the hallway, then grabbed the silver flash drive and pushed it into the laptop. A file window opened. Sarah selected the entire folder and dragged it onto the drive. The progress bar crawled across the screen while she stood over the computer, breathing fast and looking toward the bathroom every few seconds. When the copy finished, she ejected the drive, stuffed it into the pocket of her tennis skirt, and closed the laptop exactly where she had found it. I turned on the faucet for several seconds, then walked back into the living room. Sarah froze halfway to the door with one hand pressed over her pocket. "Oh, I thought you were still washing up," she stammered. "I think I should let you rest. I will tell Elijah we had a productive conversation." I crossed my arms and looked directly at her pocket. "You do that, Sarah," I said. "Take whatever you think you need, but remember that every choice has a consequence." She hurried out of the apartment with the drive still in her pocket, but her own arrogance would not let her leave quietly. She stopped a few feet down the carpeted hallway of my apartment building, her expensive tennis shoes squeaking against the floor. She slowly turned back to face me, her hand still firmly planted inside her pocket, clutching the silver flash drive. The fake panic and artificial sympathy were completely gone. In their place was pure contempt. She looked at me the same way she looked at the waitstaff at her country club. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully manipulated the angry black woman and secured her wealthy lifestyle. You really are pathetic, Kiara. Sarah said, her voice echoing slightly in the empty corridor. You thought you could hold this entire family hostage over a bruised ego. You actually believed that your little temper tantrum would bring Elijah to his knees. You are just a workhorse. You were brought into this family to do the heavy lifting so the real heirs could thrive. Malik and DeAndre are the future of Vanguard Logistics. You are just the help. You have always been the help. I stepped out of my doorway and crossed my arms, looking at her with cold amusement. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. You have a very interesting definition of family. Sarah, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly measured. You steal from me in my own home, and you justify it by claiming it is your birthright. You married my brother for his bank account, and you tolerate my existence only because my brain funds your luxury car payments. You are not a savior. You are a parasite who just panicked because the host body decided to cut off the supply. Sarah let out a sharp, cruel laugh. You can call me whatever you want, she sneered, taking a step back toward the elevator. But at the end of the day, I am the one walking out of here with the solution. I am the one who is going to hand Elijah the keys to his company. I am going to save my husband's job, and I am going to make sure that you are permanently erased from Vanguard history. You are going to be nothing, Kiara. You will be a footnote, a cautionary tale about a bitter woman who forgot her place and lost everything. I watched her chest heave with the exertion of her own malice. She was practically vibrating with the thrill of her perceived victory. She truly believed the silver drive in her pocket contained the master source codes to my routing algorithm. She had no idea she was holding a digital grenade that was wired directly to the federal authorities. You are welcome to try, Sarah, I told her, leaning casually against my doorframe. But I suggest you be very careful with what you just took from my coffee table. The logistics industry is incredibly complex, and handling proprietary information requires a certain level of intelligence. I would hate for you to stumble into something you cannot comprehend. I comprehend perfectly well that I just outsmarted you, she shot back, her eyes flashing with venom. You left your life work sitting out in the open because you were too busy feeling sorry for yourself in the bathroom. You women are all the same. You let your emotions make you careless. You build something decent, but you never have the discipline to protect it. That is why Elijah is the billionaire, and you are just an angry ex-employee living in a basic apartment. I smiled at her. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a hunter watching prey wander into a cage. My emotions are perfectly in check, Sarah. In fact, I have never felt more rational in my entire life. You came here to steal from me because you are desperate. You are terrified that without Vanguard money, you will lose your social status and have to face the reality of your own mediocrity. You need this family far more than I ever did. The elevator chimed at the end of the hallway, signaling its arrival. Sarah glanced at the metal doors and then looked back at me, her upper lip curling in disgust. I do not need to listen to your garbage anymore, she said, pulling her shoulders back. I got what I came for. I am taking this drive straight to DeAndre. They are going to use what I copied, restore the servers, and by lunchtime, you will be completely irrelevant. Good luck finding a job when Elijah blacklists your name across the corporate world. Before she stepped into the elevator, she pulled out her phone, tapped DeAndre's name, and put the call on speaker, as if she wanted me to hear one last victory lap. DeAndre answered on the second ring. Did you get it? He demanded. Sarah laughed and said she had copied the master routing folder onto the silver drive and was bringing it straight to him. Perfect, DeAndre said, his voice loud through the phone speaker. Bring it to my office. I am not waiting for the tech department to waste time checking it. I will take it down to the main server room myself, plug it in, and get the network moving before the press conference is over. Dad will finally see who actually saved this company. Sarah looked at me with a triumphant smile. I told you, she said into the phone. She was too emotional to protect it. The elevator doors opened and she stepped inside, still laughing with DeAndre as the doors began to close. I watched the metal doors slide shut on Sarah and the speakerphone call. The hallway became silent. I stepped back into my apartment, closed the door, and locked it. The laptop was exactly where I had left it, and the silver drive was gone. For the first time since Sarah arrived, I allowed myself to move quickly. I opened the laptop and checked the security feeds. The interior camera showed Sarah inserting the flash drive into my laptop and copying the folder while I was in the bathroom. A second camera covering my doorway and the public hallway had captured the confrontation outside my apartment and the entire speakerphone exchange with DeAndre before the elevator closed. The timestamps matched perfectly from the moment she entered my home to the moment she admitted what she had taken, and DeAndre announced what he planned to do with it. I exported both recordings without editing them and uploaded the original files to the secure encrypted server Terrence and I shared. I also saved the system metadata showing when the copy occurred. Now there was a clean chain from Sarah entering my apartment to her copying the folder to her telling DeAndre what she had done, and DeAndre stating that he intended to plug the drive into Vanguard's mainframe himself. Whatever happened next would not depend on anyone taking my word for it. My phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. I walked over and picked it up. It was Terrence. I answered the call and brought the phone to my ear. "Tell me she took the bait," Terrence said, his voice humming with professional excitement. "She took it hook, line, and sinker," I replied. "More importantly, the cameras caught the copy and the hallway call. She told DeAndre she had the files, and he said on speaker that he planned to plug the drive into the Vanguard mainframe himself." There was a beat of silence on the line. Then Terrence's voice turned completely businesslike. "Upload the originals and come to my office now," he said. "Do not modify the files and do not discuss the drive with anyone else. We are done guessing about what they might do. From this point forward, we only react to what we can prove." I closed my laptop, sliding it into my leather briefcase. The trap was set, and staying in my apartment felt too passive for the magnitude of what was about to happen. I needed to be with my legal counsel when the digital bomb detonated. I grabbed my keys and headed out the door, taking the elevator down to the parking garage. The drive to downtown Atlanta was a blur of morning traffic and towering glass facades. I pulled into the underground parking structure of the prestigious law firm where Terrence was a senior partner. The security guard recognized me and waved me through to the private elevator bay. I rode the elevator up to the 40th floor, feeling a quiet, steady hum of adrenaline in my veins. Terrence was waiting for me in his massive corner office. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, including the unmistakable sleek black tower that housed Vanguard Logistics just a few miles away. Terrence was standing behind his mahogany desk, wearing a sharp charcoal suit, looking every bit the legal predator he was. His desk was covered with organized stacks of injunction paperwork, and two large computer monitors were active. One monitor displayed the live stock market ticker, while the other showed a dark screen with a single blinking cursor waiting for a signal. "You made good time," Terrence said, gesturing toward a leather guest chair. "Have a seat, Kiara. The financial networks are already having a field day with the routing blackout." I sat down and looked at the stock monitor. Vanguard stock had plummeted at the opening bell. Institutional investors were panicking. Without my proprietary algorithm coordinating the 10,000 truck drivers, the company was effectively paralyzed. Millions of dollars in perishable goods were sitting on loading docks across the eastern seaboard, rotting in the morning heat. Major retail chains were publicly threatening breach of contract lawsuits. The corporate bleeding was catastrophic, and the media was demanding answers. Elijah had spent years cultivating an image of absolute operational perfection, and the sudden unexplained collapse of his entire network was completely destroying that carefully crafted narrative. Just as I settled into the chair, the news channel on a television mounted in the corner of the office cut to a breaking news alert. A local financial reporter announced that Vanguard Logistics was holding an emergency press conference to address the unprecedented supply chain failure. The camera cut to the media briefing room inside the Vanguard headquarters. The room was packed with journalists, financial analysts, and photographers. A heavy wooden podium stood at the front, adorned with the polished silver Vanguard logo. The flashbulbs illuminated the space, creating an atmosphere of intense corporate scrutiny. The side door of the briefing room opened, and my family walked out to face the cameras. My uncle Elijah stepped out first, wearing his signature dark navy suit, projecting an aura of stoic calm that I knew was entirely fabricated. He took a position slightly behind the podium, playing the role of the seasoned patriarch overseeing his empire. But it was DeAndre who stepped directly up to the microphones. DeAndre looked incredibly smug. He was practically vibrating with unearned confidence. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and smiled at the flashing cameras. He truly believed he was about to secure his legacy as the savior of the company. I noticed Sarah standing off to the side of the room near the corporate communications team. She was wearing a designer dress and holding a luxury handbag, looking extremely pleased with herself. She caught the camera lens for a brief second and offered a demure, supportive smile. She was bathing in the proximity to power, completely oblivious to the reality that she had just committed a federal crime by stealing from my apartment. She thought she had secured her country club lifestyle by handing her husband and his family the silver flash drive. She had no idea she had just delivered the instrument of their total destruction. "Good morning, everyone," DeAndre began, his voice echoing through the television speakers with smooth, practiced arrogance. "We understand there have been some concerns regarding a temporary interruption in our routing services this morning. I want to assure our shareholders, our clients, and the public that the situation is entirely under control. We experienced a minor technical glitch during a routine system update. It was a brief localized outage that our internal tech team has been working diligently to resolve." I let out a soft laugh, shaking my head at his blatant lies. A minor technical glitch. He was standing in front of the entire financial world, lying through his teeth to protect his fragile ego. He could not admit that the company was crippled because he had drunkenly fired the only person who actually owned the software infrastructure. He was spinning a fairy tale, hoping the stolen flash drive would magically fix the blackout before the market closed, and the investors demanded his resignation. As the newly appointed Vice President of Operations, DeAndre continued, puffing out his chest, I personally oversaw the recovery efforts. I am proud to announce that our dedicated information technology department has successfully isolated the issue and deployed a comprehensive patch. The routing software is currently coming back online as we speak. We anticipate a full restoration of all shipping lanes within the hour. Vanguard Logistics remains the most resilient and technologically advanced supply chain network in the country. There will be no long-term disruption to our delivery schedules, and we remain fully committed to our partners. Terrence leaned forward, placing his hands on his desk. He is digging his own grave on live television, Terrence murmured, his eyes fixed on the dark monitor displaying the tracking portal. He is establishing a public timeline. He is claiming corporate ownership of the recovery process while actively relying on stolen intellectual property. The hubris is actually staggering. If he had just stayed quiet, we would only have them on simple theft, but this public broadcast elevates the situation to securities fraud. He is lying to shareholders about the operational status of a publicly traded company. I watched DeAndre answer a few softball questions from friendly reporters planted in the audience. He was soaking up the attention, acting like a brilliant tech visionary. He used buzzwords he barely understood, talking about algorithmic optimization and dynamic server deployment. I was painting a picture of corporate triumph while standing on a foundation of absolute fraud. He looked back at Elijah, and Elijah nodded back, a rare moment of public approval from a father who usually withheld affection as a control tactic. I turned my attention away from the television and focused on the dark monitor on Terrence's desk. The blinking cursor waited patiently. Sarah had undoubtedly handed the silver flash drive over to DeAndre the moment she arrived at the building. DeAndre had probably bypassed the actual tech department, entirely wanting to be the one who physically uploaded the master codes to the server. He wanted the glory. He wanted his father to look at him with genuine pride, instead of the usual thinly veiled disappointment. He was likely standing in the server room right now, or having a subordinate plug the drive into a highly privileged administration terminal while he stalled the press. That was the first moment I let myself think about what Sarah had actually copied. The folder labeled Master Routing Source was not connected to my live routing platform. It was a decoy package built to resemble the structure and naming conventions of the real system closely enough to satisfy anyone hunting for a shortcut. The silver drive was prepared to preserve a forensic record of where that package went. It did not need to damage Vanguard's network. It only needed to identify the corporate host that opened the files and send Terrence a secure timestamp showing unauthorized use. If DeAndre had handed the drive to counsel and asked for permission, Nothing would happen. If he had returned it untouched, nothing would happen. The evidence mattered only if Vanguard chose to use material taken from my apartment after its license had already ended. Sarah had supplied the copy. DeAndre had just announced on camera that his internal team was restoring the system. All we were waiting for now was the digital record connecting those two acts. The press conference on the television began to wrap up. DeAndre offered one final arrogant smile to the cameras, reiterating that Vanguard was stronger than ever. Elijah patted his son on the back, a performative gesture of paternal pride for the media. Sarah clapped enthusiastically from the sidelines, her elite future seemingly secured. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully erased me from the narrative and stolen my life work without consequence. They believed their wealth and status made them untouchable and beyond the reach of the very laws they used to oppress others. The room was quiet, except for the low murmur of the reporters on the television broadcast, transitioning back to the news anchor. Then the silence was broken by a sharp, distinct electronic chime. The dark monitor on Terrence's desk suddenly sprang to life. A bright red notification box flashed across the center of the screen, illuminating the dark mahogany of his desk. The text was stark and undeniable. Unauthorized network access detected. Host location confirmed as Vanguard Logistics corporate headquarters. Digital watermark successfully deployed. Tracking beacon active. I felt a cold thrill wash over me. The trap had sprung flawlessly. Sarah had delivered the drive. DeAndre had plugged it in. They had just crossed the point of no return, blindly walking into their own demise. I looked up at Terrence. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face as he read the confirmation data flowing across his screen. He reached out and placed his hand on the thick stack of federal injunction documents resting on his desk. He looked at me, his eyes alight with professional satisfaction and the thrill of the impending legal slaughter. They just plugged the flash drive into the Vanguard mainframe. Terrence said, his voice low and dangerous. Are you ready to pull the trigger? I looked at the blinking red notification on the monitor and felt a slow smile spread across my face. I am ready. Terrence, I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady. Pull the trigger. Terrence did not hesitate. His fingers moved rapidly across his keyboard as he executed the final commands. He submitted the prepared intellectual property theft injunction directly to the federal judge who was waiting on standby. We had meticulously documented everything over the last few years to ensure this exact process would be seamless. The digital watermark embedded in the decoy flash drive proved undeniable ownership of the routing algorithms. Sarah stealing the drive from my apartment and DeAndre plugging it into the Vanguard mainframe provided the criminal intent required for immediate federal action. The trap had closed perfectly around all of them. Within minutes, Terrence received a digital confirmation from the federal court. The judge reviewed the tracking data and the copyright patents. The injunction was granted instantly. It was not just a cease and desist order. It was a complete and total freeze of all Vanguard Logistics assets, pending a federal investigation for corporate espionage and the theft of trade secrets. They had crossed the line from a simple family dispute to a major federal crime involving a $4 billion corporation. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the sleek black tower of the Vanguard headquarters in the distance. The sun was shining brightly over the Atlanta skyline, but a massive storm was about to hit my uncle Elijah and his golden child. The financial market reacted first. The moment the federal injunction was filed, the news hit the wire services. Financial analysts who had just watched DeAndre lie during his arrogant press conference were now staring at federal court documents proving he had committed intellectual property theft. Vanguard stock, which had already been dropping all morning, suddenly went into an absolute freefall. The stock exchange had to automatically halt trading on their shares due to the unprecedented volatility. The company was hemorrhaging value by the second. Terrence stood beside me, looking out the window with a cup of coffee in his hand. They are currently locked out of their own bank accounts, Terrence said, his tone reflecting deep professional satisfaction. The federal freeze applies to all corporate operational funds. They cannot process payroll, they cannot pay independent contractors, and they cannot settle any breach of contract penalties. They are financially paralyzed, Kiara. The reality of the situation was staggering. For 9 years, I had poured my sweat and tears into building that company, while Elijah treated me like an indentured servant. He believed my brain was his personal property. He thought he could discard me like trash and replace me with a stolen flash drive. He vastly underestimated the intelligence of the black woman he kept hidden in the shadows. I watched a news helicopter begin to circle the Vanguard Tower. The media had caught wind of the federal injunction, and the story was escalating from a supply chain glitch to a massive corporate scandal. My phone began to vibrate wildly on Terrence's desk. It was Malik. I walked over and picked it up, staring at my brother's name on the screen. I was probably calling from his desk in the Vanguard accounting department, completely terrified, as the corporate accounts locked down one by one. I let it ring. Malik had chosen to stand by silently while Sarah insulted me and Elijah threatened me. He needed to feel the consequences of his passivity. If he wanted to survive the fallout, he would have to find his own backbone. I put the phone on silent and turned my attention back to the television monitor in the corner of the office. The news channels were breaking away from their regular programming to cover the unfolding disaster. A reporter standing outside the Vanguard headquarters was speaking frantically into her microphone. She announced that federal marshals had just arrived at the building to execute a search and seizure warrant. The camera zoomed in on a fleet of dark government vehicles, pulling up to the main entrance of the glass tower. Agents wearing tactical vests and carrying empty evidence boxes marched through the revolving doors. They were going straight up to the executive suites to confiscate the servers and the stolen flash drive. DeAndre was about to meet the very authorities he thought he could outsmart. "I want to see the look on his face," I murmured, feeling a cold sense of justice settling over me. DeAndre had stood in front of those cameras just an hour ago, bragging about his leadership and his technical brilliance. Now he was going to be escorted out of his own building by federal agents. His arrogance had finally caught up to him. Terrence nodded slowly. "Elijah will try to pin the blame on Sarah," Terrence observed. "He will claim she stole the drive without his knowledge and brought it to the office. But the surveillance footage from your apartment proves she took it, and the server logs prove DeAndre authorized the upload. Elijah cannot protect his son from federal espionage charges. The golden child is going to face prison time." The thought of Sarah trying to explain her actions to federal investigators brought a sharp smile to my lips. She had walked into my home reeking of white privilege and elitist entitlement, calling me an angry black woman who did not know her place. She thought she was the savior of her wealthy lifestyle. Instead, she was the primary suspect in a corporate theft ring. Her country club friends would be watching her downfall on the evening news. The money she married my brother for was completely frozen. Her luxury cars and her house in Buckhead were suddenly entirely out of her reach. She had gambled everything on her own supposed superiority, and she had lost spectacularly. The television showed chaotic scenes from the Vanguard lobby. Employees were being evacuated from the building as the federal marshals secured the premises. People were rushing out with their personal belongings, looking confused and terrified. The empire Elijah built was crumbling brick by brick. He had built his fortune on the backs of marginalized workers demanding absolute loyalty while offering nothing but scraps in return. He had treated his own niece like disposable labor. Now his legacy was being packed into cardboard evidence boxes. My phone lit up again. This time it was an email notification. It was a formal communication from the Vanguard Board of Directors. The subject line read, "Urgent request for meeting." I opened the email and read the brief, desperate message. The board was in a total panic. The chairman was formally requesting a meeting with me and my legal counsel to discuss the immediate lifting of the injunction and the restoration of the routing software. They were offering to negotiate any terms necessary to save the company from total liquidation. I handed the phone to Terrence to quickly read the message. "They are bleeding out," Terrence said, handing the phone back to me. "The suppliers are threatening to seize their fleet of trucks. The retail clients are preparing massive lawsuits for the delayed shipments. The board knows that Elijah and DeAndre just destroyed the company. They also know that you are the only person on the planet who can turn the lights back on. You hold all the leverage, Kiara. Every single drop of it." "I do not want to negotiate with the board yet," I said, walking back to the window. I want Elijah to feel the full weight of his failure. I want him to look around his empty office and realize that his wealth, his status, and his power were all illusions sustained by my silent labor. I want him to know what it feels like to be completely powerless. Let them sweat for the rest of this day. Let federal marshals tear apart his servers. Let media drag his name through the mud. We will meet with them tomorrow. Terrence smiled, his respect evident. You are a brilliant tactician, Kiara. Waiting will increase their desperation. By tomorrow, they will sign away their souls to get that software back. We will dictate terms, and they will have no choice. I stood by the window and watched the chaos unfold. For the first time, I did not feel the crushing weight of family obligation. The trauma and guilt Elijah used to control me were gone, completely burned away by his own massive greed. I was no longer the frightened orphan grateful for a roof over my head. I was a powerhouse who brought a billion-dollar logistics empire to its knees today. The king was dead, and the new architect was ready to claim her throne. Let them panic while I sit here in absolute peace, preparing to take back everything they stole from me. This is what justice feels like. The morning after the federal raid, my phone rang. It was a text from my uncle Elijah demanding my presence at his private estate in Buckhead. He told me to bring my lawyer and my brother Malik, stating we were going to resolve this matter internally before the media completely destroyed the Vanguard legacy. I showed the message to Terrence, who simply adjusted his tie and told me to get my car keys. We drove through the sprawling iron gates of Elijah's massive property an hour later. The estate was an absolute monument to excessive wealth, featuring a massive stone fountain in the center of the circular driveway and perfectly manicured gardens that stretched outward for several acres of pristine green land. I parked my sedan right next to DeAndre's bright red sports car. I stepped out and looked at the towering brick facade. For years, I had come to this house through the side entrance carrying presentation binders, while the rest of the family drank wine on the back patio. Today, I walked straight up the front steps with Terrence by my side. The oak door swung open before we knocked. Elijah's security guard ushered us into the grand foyer. The space was intentionally intimidating, with a massive crystal chandelier hanging straight down from the vaulted ceiling and a sweeping double staircase lined with gold. But the people standing at the bottom of those stairs did not look intimidating at all. They looked like cornered animals. Elijah was pacing the marble floor, his usual immaculate appearance completely shattered. DeAndre was sitting on a velvet bench looking pale and deeply panicked. The arrogant golden child who had thrown champagne on me was completely gone. He was currently facing federal espionage charges, and the reality of prison time had crushed his spirit. Sarah was standing near the fireplace, pacing back and forth while frantically chewing on her thumbnail. Her designer dress looked rumpled and her eyes were red from crying. Malik was standing off to the side, keeping a physical distance from his wife and his uncle. My brother looked exhausted, but there was a strange new clarity in his eyes when he looked at me. He held my gaze and gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. Elijah stopped pacing the moment Terrence and I walked into the room. He glared at us. "I see you brought your attack dog." Elijah growled, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "I told you this was a family meeting, Kiara. We do not need outside counsel complicating things." Terrence smiled, a cold, sharp expression. "I am not outside counsel, Elijah," Terrence replied smoothly. "I am a senior partner representing Meridian Freight Solutions, the company you just attempted to defraud. I go wherever my client goes." Elijah clenched his jaw but decided not to argue. He turned back to me and took a deep breath, attempting to compose himself. "Kiara, we need to stop this madness right now," Elijah said, gesturing around the room. "Look at what you are doing to this family. You have federal agents tearing apart my offices right now. You have the media painting my son as a common thief. You are destroying the legacy that feeds all of us." "I did not destroy anything, Uncle Elijah," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "You and DeAndre destroyed your own legacy when you decided to steal my life work instead of paying for it." Sarah suddenly rushed forward, her hands clasped together in a desperate pleading motion. "Please, Kiara," she cried out, her voice shaking. "You have to lift the injunction. My bank accounts are completely frozen. The country club just suspended our membership. You are ruining my entire life." I looked at Sarah with absolute disgust. You ruined your own life, Sarah, I told her coldly, looking directly into her red and puffy eyes, without a single ounce of pity or remorse. You walked into my home and stole a flash drive because you thought I was too stupid to protect myself. You committed a federal crime to save your country club status. I suggest you find a good defense attorney to represent you in federal court. Elijah stepped between us, waving Sarah away dismissively. Enough of this emotional garbage, he barked. He walked over to a heavy oak console table and picked up a thick manila folder. He slammed the folder down on the marble coffee table. Let us cut the nonsense and talk numbers, Kiara. I know why you are doing this. You feel underappreciated. Elijah opened the thick folder, revealing a single crisp sheet of paper with the official corporate letterhead stamped at the very top. I am prepared to be generous, he said, adopting a tone of magnanimous grace. I am offering you $1 million in cash right now. I will wire the funds to an offshore account the moment you lift the federal injunction and sign over the complete intellectual property rights to the routing software. $1 million, Kiara. That is more money than your dead parents ever saw in their entire lives. You can take this money, buy yourself a nice house in the suburbs, and walk away completely clean. All you have to do is drop the charges against DeAndre and give me back my company. I stared at the piece of paper and then looked up at my uncle. I actually laughed. $1 million, I repeated, shaking my head. You value a $4 billion logistics infrastructure at $1 million. You really do think I am just a poor little orphan desperate for a handout. That software saves Vanguard $50 million a quarter in fuel costs alone. You are offering me pennies on the dollar to save your son from a federal prison sentence. Elijah lost his temper completely. His face flushed a dark, angry red. You listen to me, you ungrateful little brat, he roared, stepping aggressively into my personal space. You should be down on your knees thanking me for this offer. You should be grateful for the scraps I am throwing you right now. If I do not get that software back by tomorrow morning, the board is going to liquidate the company. I will lose everything. And if I lose everything, I swear to God, I will take Malik down with me in a fiery crash. I will frame him for embezzlement and make sure he rots in a cell right next to DeAndre. Sign the paper or I destroy your brother today. The room went dead silent. Terrence shifted his weight, ready to intervene, but I held up my hand. I did not need to defend Malik this time. For the first time in his entire life, my younger brother stepped forward. Do not threaten my sister again, Elijah, Malik said. His voice was surprisingly loud, cutting through the tension like a knife. Malik walked directly up to our uncle, standing tall and squaring his shoulders. Elijah looked at him in genuine shock. I am done being your hostage, Malik continued. I spent the last 10 years letting you treat Kiara like garbage because I was terrified to lose my job. I watched her work herself to the bone to protect me, and I never once protected her. That ends today. You cannot fire me, Elijah, because I already quit. I sent my official resignation to Human Resources an hour ago. Elijah stared at Malik wordlessly. He had lost his ultimate point of leverage. Sarah let out a blood-curdling scream. Are you out of your mind? She shrieked, rushing toward Malik and grabbing his arm with both of her hands. You quit your job. We have a mortgage, Malik. We have car payments. You need to beg him for forgiveness right now. We are going to be bankrupt. Malik slowly removed Sarah's hands from his arm. You do not care about me, Sarah, he said softly. You only care about your social status. You even committed a felony for this toxic family to secure your place in their inner circle. I am done pretending this is a real marriage. Sarah backed away from him, pale. You cannot do this to me, she stammered, tears ruining her expensive makeup as she continued to weep openly. I am not walking away, Malik replied. I am running from this poisonous environment. Malik reached inside his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. He held it out toward Sarah. Her hands were shaking as she opened the flap and pulled out the stack of documents inside. She read the first page and her entire body went rigid. What is this? She whispered. Those are divorce papers, Malik told her loud enough for everyone to hear. My lawyer filed them this morning. I am taking my name off the house and the cars. Sarah dropped the papers onto the marble floor, sobbing hysterically, begging him to reconsider. Malik stepped back, walking over to stand shoulder to shoulder with me. We looked at our uncle together, a united front. "You lose, Uncle Elijah," I said, my voice ringing with quiet authority. "You cannot buy my life work for $1 million. You cannot threaten my brother anymore. Your reign is over." Elijah's face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. "You think you have won," he sneered, stepping back. "I always have a backup plan, Kiara. You really think that little company of yours makes you untouchable? You are still the little orphan you always were. You are standing in my house celebrating too early, and you are about to learn how quickly paper can erase everything you think you own." The sound of Sarah crying echoed off the high marble walls of the grand foyer, but Uncle Elijah did not even flinch. He looked down at the divorce papers scattered across his pristine floor with absolute disgust. He stepped right over the documents and completely ignored the sobbing white woman who had just realized her country club lifestyle was entirely finished. Elijah turned his cold, dark eyes away from Malik and focused all his predatory energy back on me. He clapped his hands together, a slow and mocking sound that cut through the tension in the room. He told Malik that he was a weak and pathetic man for throwing away his marriage over a sister who cared for nobody but herself. He said Malik was officially dead to him and would be escorted off the Vanguard premises by security if he ever dared to show his face at the corporate headquarters again. Malik did not argue or defend himself. He just stood firmly by my side, proving that the toxic grip our uncle had held over him for 2 decades was finally broken. Elijah walked away from us and moved toward a massive oak bookshelf that lined the far wall of his entry room. He told me I really thought I had outsmarted the entire family. He said I actually believed my little digital trap with the silver flash drive and the federal injunction would bring him to his knees. He pulled a thick leather binder from the middle shelf and carried it back to the marble coffee table. He dropped it down with a heavy thud. He said I was nothing but a naive little girl playing a corporate game I did not fully understand. He told Terrence that filing a federal injunction was a cute legal trick, but it was ultimately useless against a man who built his empire by anticipating every possible threat. Elijah opened the leather binder and pulled out a single stack of stapled papers. The pages looked slightly yellowed at the edges, as if they had been sitting in a filing cabinet for almost a decade. He slid the stack of papers across the smooth marble surface until it stopped directly in front of Terrence and me. I looked down at the top page and immediately recognized the standard Vanguard Logistics corporate letterhead. It was an employment contract. My name was printed clearly at the top, along with my old address from 9 years ago when I first started working in the dispatch center. I picked up the document and began reading the first few paragraphs. The terms outlined a standard entry-level role, but as I flipped to the second page, the legal language shifted dramatically. There was an incredibly aggressive intellectual property assignment clause buried deep within the fine print. Terrence leaned over my shoulder, reading the text alongside me. The clause explicitly stated that any software program's algorithms or routing systems created by the employee during the entire duration of their employment belonged solely and exclusively to Vanguard Logistics. It further specified that this ownership applied regardless of whether the intellectual property was developed on company time using company resources or completely independently on personal equipment. A second clause imposed an aggressively broad non-compete restriction that barred me from developing licensing consulting on or profiting from any logistics technology anywhere in North America for 10 years after leaving Vanguard. I flipped to the final page and saw my own signature resting perfectly on the bottom line. My blood ran cold. The signature was a flawless replica of my handwriting. Every curve and slant of the ink matched the way I signed my name when I was 23 years old. But I had never seen this document before in my life. I had never signed an intellectual property assignment agreement. When I was hired, Elijah had handed me a basic non-disclosure form and told me to get to work. This entire contract was a complete forgery. I looked up at my uncle. I was watching my face closely, soaking in the exact moment he thought he had destroyed my safety net. He smiled, a wicked and triumphant expression that contorted his features. He told me he always kept a backup plan for employees who forgot their place in the hierarchy. He said he had his top lawyers draft this specialized contract yesterday afternoon and carefully backdate it to the exact day I started my employment at Vanguard 9 years ago. Terrence picked up the forged contract from my hands and examined the fraudulent signature closely. He kept his expression professionally neutral, but I could feel the tension radiating from his posture. Terrence told Elijah that submitting a forged legal document to a federal court was a massive criminal offense that carried severe prison time. Elijah just laughed out loud, throwing his head back with genuine amusement. He told Terrence that it was only a forgery if someone could prove it was fake. He pointed out that the document was printed on old company letterhead and signed with a pen that matched the exact ink used by the Human Resources Department a decade ago. He boasted that his legal team had ensured the metadata on the digital files was perfectly scrubbed and matched the timeline of my hiring process. He said by the time any handwriting expert could be brought in to analyze the physical paper, the company would already be saved. Elijah walked around the coffee table and stood directly in front of me, blocking my view of my brother and Terrence. He told me the Vanguard Board of Directors was holding a mandatory emergency meeting tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. He explained that he was going to present this employment contract to the entire board and the shareholders. He said the document legally nullified my independent software license and proved that Meridian Freight Solutions was nothing but a shell company built on stolen corporate property. He said the board would vote to forcefully absorb my limited liability company and all its assets directly back into the Vanguard corporate portfolio. He told me the federal judge would have no choice but to lift the injunction once the board presented proof that the software was officially company property all along. He said my little rebellion was over and I had absolutely nothing left to fight with. I looked at the forged contract resting in Terrence's hands and then looked back into my uncle's cold eyes. I did not scream or accuse him of being a criminal. Emotional reactions were exactly what he wanted to see. He thrived on fear and desperation. Instead, I kept my breathing even and my posture completely relaxed. Elijah stepped even closer, invading my personal space, just like DeAndre had done at the birthday gala. He looked down at me with absolute contempt. He told me I was nothing but a pathetic, ungrateful child who tried to bite the hand that fed her. He said I thought I was a powerful businesswoman, but I was just a delusional little orphan who would always be begging for scraps. "You are still the little orphan, Kiara." He sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You will always belong to me and you lose." He pointed toward the heavy oak doors at the front of his massive estate and ordered us to leave. He told Terrence Malick and me to get out of his house and never return. He said he would see me in the corporate boardroom tomorrow morning to officially strip away my life work. I did not say a single word in response to his threats. I simply nodded to Terrence and my brother. We turned around and walked out of the grand foyer, leaving Sarah sobbing loudly on the marble floor, while my uncle celebrated his fraudulent victory. As we walked down the front steps toward my parked car, I felt absolutely no panic or despair. Elijah thought his forged employment contract was the ultimate trump card. He had no idea I possessed a far more destructive hidden weapon that I was going to unleash during that meeting to destroy his legacy. I woke up the next morning feeling more rested than I had in 9 years. I took my time choosing a tailored black suit that projected absolute authority. Today was the day I was going to dismantle my uncle's empire completely. I drove to downtown Atlanta and parked my car in the visitor structure next to the sleek glass tower of Vanguard Logistics. Terrence was waiting for me in the main lobby holding a sleek leather briefcase. The building was crawling with federal agents and private security teams, but Terrence had already coordinated our entry with the authorities managing the injunction. We walked past the empty reception desk and stepped into the executive elevator. The ride to the top floor was quiet and steady. We stepped out onto the plush carpet of the executive suite and walked directly toward the main boardroom. The heavy double doors were slightly ajar. I could hear my uncle Elijah projecting his deep baritone voice across the room. I pushed the doors open and walked inside with Terrence right behind me. The boardroom was massive, featuring a long mahogany table surrounded by 24 nervous board members and major shareholders. Elijah was standing at the head of the table holding the forged employment contract in his hand. DeAndre was sitting to his right, looking incredibly smug and relaxed. Elijah stopped speaking the moment I walked into the room. He glared at me and demanded to know how I got past security. He told me this was a closed meeting for shareholders and executive board members only. He pointed a finger at the door and ordered me to leave the premises immediately. I did not flinch, and I did not stop walking. I moved toward the empty end of the long table, taking my time. DeAndre laughed and told the board members not to worry about my presence. He said I was just a disgruntled former employee who was having a hard time accepting reality. Elijah held up the forged contract for the entire board to see. He told them that my presence here was actually perfect timing because he wanted me to witness the end of my little extortion attempt. He explained to the nervous shareholders that they had absolutely nothing to worry about regarding the federal injunction or the frozen assets. He said his legal team had located my original employment contract from 9 years ago. He told the room that the document contained an ironclad intellectual property assignment clause proving that Vanguard Logistics was the sole and exclusive owner of the routing software I had created. He also emphasized a sweeping non-compete clause that he claimed prevented me and Meridian Freight Solutions from operating independently after my termination. He said the injunction was going to be lifted by noon, because he was going to present this legally binding contract to the federal judge and prove that I was the one committing fraud. The board members let out a collective sigh of relief. They were desperate old men who only cared about their stock portfolios and their quarterly dividends. They did not care if the document was fake. They only cared that Elijah was offering them a lifeline to save their billions. One of the senior board members smiled and commended Elijah on his excellent record-keeping. He said they needed to move quickly to absorb my limited liability company and get the trucks moving again before the retail clients officially breached their contracts. DeAndre leaned back in his leather chair and folded his hands behind his head. He looked at me with absolute contempt. He told me I was incredibly stupid to think I could outsmart the men who built this company. He said I was going to lose my software, my money, and my entire reputation by lunchtime. He laughed and said he would personally make sure I was prosecuted for trying to extort the company with a stolen algorithm. I thought the forged paper was an impenetrable shield that would restore their empire and bury me forever. I looked at the smug faces of my uncle and my cousin. I did not scream or accuse them of being criminals. I simply pulled out a chair and sat down at the table, resting my hands on the polished wood. I looked at Terrence and gave him a single nod. Terrence stepped forward, placing his leather briefcase on the table. He did not address my uncle or my cousin. He looked directly at the chairman of the board. Terrence introduced himself as senior counsel representing Meridian Freight Solutions. He told the board members that before they voted to absorb my company based on a fraudulent document, they needed to hear a very important piece of digital evidence. Elijah slammed his hand on the table and ordered Terrence to shut his mouth. He told the board that Terrence was just trying to stall the inevitable and demanded that security be called to remove us from the building. The chairman of the board raised his hand and told Elijah to calm down. The chairman was a cautious man who had survived decades in corporate America by avoiding unnecessary risks. He looked at Terrence and told him to proceed with his evidence but warned him that it had better be relevant to the injunction. Terrence smiled a cold, sharp expression. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a small digital audio player. He connected it to the boardroom's central audio system using a wireless link. Terrence explained to the board that what they were about to hear came from the security system covering my apartment doorway and the public hallway the previous morning. He pressed play. Sarah's voice filled the boardroom first, bragging that she had copied the master routing folder onto the silver drive and was taking it directly to DeAndre. Then the recording captured her calling him on speaker. Every person at the table heard DeAndre ask if she had the files and heard Sarah confirm exactly how she had copied them from my laptop. Then DeAndre's recorded voice became unmistakable. He told Sarah to bring the drive straight to his office. He said he was not going to wait for the technology department to review it. He bragged that he would carry it to the main server room, plug it into Vanguard's system himself, and take credit for restoring the network before the press conference ended. Sarah laughed and told him I had been too emotional to protect my own work. The call ended only when the elevator doors closed and carried her out of camera range. The boardroom descended into horrified silence. The executives understood exactly what the recording established. Sarah had described copying material from my personal laptop without permission. DeAndre had acknowledged receiving it and stated his intention to bypass his own technology staff and use it on Vanguard's mainframe. Nobody had to infer a secret plan from my version of events. They had heard the plan in Sarah and DeAndre's own voices. Elijah's confident posture collapsed. He looked at his son with wide, panicked eyes. DeAndre shrank into his leather chair, his face suddenly drained of color. He had spent the morning presenting himself as the executive who rescued Vanguard. Now the board had heard him describe exactly how he intended to use files taken from my apartment. The same arrogance he had used to claim credit had just destroyed his defense. Terrence disconnected the player and told the board that the original unedited security files and their timestamps had already been preserved with the evidence supporting the injunction. He explained that the recording showed Sarah and DeAndre acting as if Vanguard had no lawful access to the source material and therefore needed to take it from me instead. He did not ask the board to trust our interpretation. He asked them to compare the recording with the server access logs and DeAndre's own public statement from the press conference. Terrence pointed at the forged employment contract resting on the table in front of Elijah. He told the board that attempting to present a backdated fraudulent document to a federal judge after the executives had already confessed to stealing the software was a guaranteed path to a federal prison sentence. He said any board member who voted to support Elijah's fraudulent claim would be legally implicated in a massive conspiracy to commit corporate fraud and intellectual property theft. The chairman of the board stood up, his hands shaking slightly. He looked at Elijah with pure, unadulterated fury. He told Elijah that he had assured the board this was a simple licensing dispute with a disgruntled former employee. He asked Elijah if he realized his son had just exposed the entire corporation to federal criminal liability. The other board members began shouting over each other, demanding answers and threatening to call their personal attorneys. The illusion of Vanguard Logistics as a stable industry leader was completely shattered. They were turning on Elijah, just as I knew they would, when their personal wealth was threatened by his incompetence. Elijah tried to speak over the shouting, trying to regain control of the room. He claimed the recordings were taken out of context. He said Sarah acted alone and DeAndre was just confused about the nature of the flash drive. He begged the board to stay united and trust his legal strategy, but his words fell on deaf ears. The board members were not listening to him anymore. They were looking at me. They realized I was the only person in the room who held the power to stop the bleeding. They knew I had orchestrated this entire scenario to expose my uncle's corruption and trap his son. I sat quietly at the end of the long mahogany table watching the chaos unfold. For 9 years, Elijah had demanded my silence and my submission. He had built his empire on the false belief that I would always accept the scraps he threw at me. Now his legacy was burning to the ground in front of his eyes, and his golden child was facing a federal indictment. But I was not finished. The audio recordings were just the appetizer. I still had the main course waiting in my briefcase. I looked at DeAndre, who was now sweating profusely. I looked at Elijah, who was desperately trying to calm the enraged shareholders. They had brought a forged piece of paper to a federal gunfight. The boardroom massacre had officially begun, and I was holding all the cards. I was about to drop a bomb that would force them to strip Elijah of his crown and hand the entire kingdom over to me. The boardroom was still echoing with the panicked shouts of the shareholders when my uncle Elijah slammed both of his fists down on the mahogany table. I was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his tailored suit, but he was not ready to surrender. He looked at the terrified men and women sitting around him and raised his voice to a booming command, demanding absolute silence. He told them to stop acting like frightened children. He pointed a trembling finger at the forged employment contract still resting on the table. He told the board that the audio recording was nothing but a distraction. He admitted his son made a foolish mistake, but insisted it did not change the foundational legal reality. He claimed the backdated contract proved Vanguard Logistics owned the routing software, and that federal judges cared about paper trails, not family squabbles. He demanded the board immediately vote to absorb Meridian Freight Solutions so their legal team could present a united front to the federal courts. He said they just needed to weather a minor public relations storm, and by tomorrow the trucks would be moving again, and the profits would continue to flow. I watched him desperately trying to glue his crumbling empire back together. He really believed that a single piece of fraudulent paper could save him from the avalanche I had prepared. I stood up from my chair at the end of the table. The simple movement drew every single eye in the room toward me. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout like my uncle. True power never has to yell to command a room. You are missing the point entirely. Uncle Elijah, I said, keeping my tone conversational and calm. You are standing here begging this board to steal my software because you think the algorithms are the only thing keeping your trucks on the road. You think logistics is just about computer code and digital routing servers. That is because you have spent the last decade sitting in a leather chair looking at spreadsheets, while I was down in the dirt actually building your network. I unlatched the brass locks on my leather briefcase. The sharp clicks sounded like gunshots in the quiet room. I reached inside and pulled out a massive stack of thick linen paper. It was heavy, substantial, and completely lethal to my uncle's remaining defenses. I dropped the stack of documents onto the polished mahogany table. I placed my hand flat on top of the pile and slowly pushed it down the center of the table toward the chairman of the board. The chairman was a pale older man who looked like he was on the verge of a massive cardiac event. He reached out with trembling hands and pulled the stack of papers toward himself. Let me educate you on how this industry actually operates, I told the room, my voice steady and unwavering. Vanguard Logistics does not own a single delivery truck. You are a freight brokerage. You rely entirely on independent owner-operators and private fleet suppliers to move your cargo from the ports to the retail warehouses. You need their absolute loyalty to survive. But you have never once spoken to a driver, Uncle Elijah. You have never visited a dispatch hub at 3 in the morning to negotiate a fuel surcharge. DeAndre has never shaken the hand of a fleet owner who was struggling to make weekly payroll. I began walking slowly down the length of the table, closing the distance between myself and the panicked board members. I am the one who sat down with those fleet owners. I continued, my gaze sweeping across the faces of the wealthy investors. I am the one who restructured their payment schedules so they would not go bankrupt during the fuel crisis last year. I am the one who authorized emergency maintenance funds when their rigs broke down in the snow. While you were taking credit for my profit margins, I was building ironclad relationships with the men and women who physically move your billions of dollars in freight. They do not know who DeAndre is. They do not respect Elijah. They only know me. The chairman of the board flipped open the first few pages of the stack. His face drained of whatever color he had left. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing in sheer disbelief. He stared at the bold letterhead of the largest trucking consortium on the eastern seaboard. What are these documents? Terrence asked, adopting a tone of professional inquiry to guide the board toward their own execution. Those are 50 signed letters of intent, I replied, stopping right behind the chairman's seat. They are legally binding declarations from the top 50 independent freight operators on the East Coast. The very same operators who control 80% of the shipping capacity Vanguard relies upon to fulfill its major retail contracts. Elijah scoffed, his voice dripping with intense condescension. You think letters of intent matter, Kiara. We have massive non-compete clauses with all our major carriers. They cannot legally work for anyone else. They have to drive for Vanguard, or they face severe financial penalties. They do not have to drive for anyone. Uncle Elijah, I corrected him softly. I looked down at the chairman, who was currently reading the text of the first letter with wide, terrified eyes. Read the document aloud to the board, Mr. Chairman. Tell my uncle what his drivers are currently doing while he worries about a stolen flash drive. The chairman swallowed hard. He looked at Elijah and then down at the paper. His voice shook as he read the words out loud. It says here that effective as of 9:45 last night, the undersigned freight operators are initiating a full operational strike. They are citing a fundamental breach of faith and a hostile work environment due to the termination of the primary director of supply chain. It says they will absolutely refuse to move a single piece of Vanguard cargo until Kiara is reinstated as their sole point of contact. The boardroom erupted into chaos all over again. The shareholders began cursing loudly. DeAndre slumped down in his leather chair. burying his face in his hands, as the reality of the situation finally penetrated his arrogant skull. They had all believed the total blackout was solely caused by my software being pulled from the corporate servers. They thought if they could just steal the code back or force the federal judge to lift the injunction, the crisis would be completely resolved. I waited for the noise to die down before I delivered the final devastating blow. The software glitch was just a symptom, I told the silent, horrified room. The trucks are not sitting idle at the way stations just because their navigation tablets went dark. They are parked because I told them to park. I called the heads of all 50 major fleets last night from a diner while I was eating my waffles. I told them you fired me disrespectfully. They drafted those letters and signed them before midnight. They are standing with me. You do not just have a digital problem. You have a massive labor strike that you cannot possibly fix with a forged employment contract. Elijah stared at me, his chest heaving rapidly. His hands were gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He opened his mouth to shout another vicious threat, but no words came out. He was completely defeated. He had absolutely nothing left to leverage. He could not threaten my brother because Malik had already quit. He could not steal my software because the federal authorities had already locked down his building. And he could not force the trucks to move because the drivers were entirely loyal to me. The chairman of the board slowly let the thick stack of papers fall from his hands. He looked across the long, polished table at my uncle. The chairman had spent years enabling Elijah's toxic behavior because the money was good and the returns were steady. But now the money was gone, and basic survival instincts were kicking in. She does not just own the software, Elijah, the chairman said, his voice barely more than a terrified whisper. She is the supply chain. The words hung in the air, a profound and undeniable truth that completely shattered the Vanguard legacy forever. The board members looked at me, no longer seeing a disgruntled former employee or an arrogant niece's rebellion. They saw the absolute ruler of their financial future. They saw the only person who could save them from total corporate ruin. So what are your terms? Kiara, one of the senior shareholders, asked, his voice practically begging for a lifeline. What will it take for you to lift the federal injunction and call off the massive freight strike? We are willing to offer you a highly lucrative executive compensation package and full ownership recognition of your limited liability company right now. I walked back to my seat at the end of the table. I did not sit down. I stood tall, framing myself against the backdrop of the Atlanta skyline, visible through the expansive boardroom windows. I looked directly at Elijah, watching the last shreds of his immense pride crumbling into dust. I do not want an executive compensation package, I stated clearly and coldly. I am not interested in working for a company that tolerates fraud, corporate espionage, and theft. My terms are entirely non-negotiable. First, you will draft a binding legal agreement, officially relinquishing any and all claims to Meridian Freight Solutions and my proprietary routing software. Second, you will provide me with absolute legal immunity from any corporate sabotage claims you might attempt to fabricate. The board members nodded eagerly, desperately willing to sign anything I demanded to stop the bleeding. But that is just the beginning. I continued, my voice hardening into steel. If you want me to turn the servers back on and tell those loyal drivers to start moving cargo again, I require a complete and total change in leadership. Uncle Elijah and DeAndre will step down from all executive positions effective immediately. They will surrender their voting shares and completely divest from Vanguard Logistics. They will clear out their offices today, under the strict supervision of the federal marshals currently waiting down in the lobby. Elijah slammed his fist on the table again. "You cannot do this!" he roared, his face twisting in desperate rage. "I built this company. It is my name on the building. You cannot force me out of my own legacy." "I am not forcing you out, Uncle Elijah," I replied calmly. "The board is going to force you out. Because if they do not, I will walk out that door right now and leave you all to deal with the federal espionage charges, the ruined supply chain, and the massive breach of contract lawsuits. Vanguard will be bankrupt by Friday morning." I looked at the chairman of the board. "You have exactly 5 minutes to draft the severance agreements and hand me the title of Chief Executive Officer. If you fail, I walk. Make your choice, gentlemen." I crossed my arms and waited in the silence. The boardroom massacre was complete. Now it was time to watch the vultures turn on their king. The chairman of the board did not even wait for the 5 minutes to expire. He looked at my uncle Elijah with a mixture of absolute disgust and sheer terror. The chairman slammed his hand down on the polished mahogany table and called for an immediate emergency vote. He stated clearly that the motion on the floor was to terminate Elijah and DeAndre for cause citing gross negligence, corporate espionage, and the catastrophic mismanagement of company assets. Elijah stood up and tried to threaten the entire room. He puffed out his chest and reminded the shareholders that his name was on the building. He said he was the visionary who made them all filthy rich and claimed they owed him their unwavering loyalty. But loyalty in corporate America only lasts exactly as long as the profit margins stay green. The board members raised their hands one by one without a single second of hesitation. It was a completely unanimous decision. They stripped my powerful uncle of his crown and his company in less than 60 seconds. The corporate attorneys working for the board rapidly slid the drafted severance agreements across the long table. The legal documents officially relinquished all of Elijah's voting shares and completely divested him and his son from Vanguard Logistics. The chairman looked at Elijah and told him that if he did not sign the papers right now, the board of directors would personally join the federal lawsuit against DeAndre. Elijah stared at the expensive pen resting on top of the legal documents. The arrogant billionaire patriarch was entirely gone. He picked up the pen with trembling hands and signed his empire away in total silence. DeAndre finally snapped. The reality that his golden parachute was gone and he was facing federal prison completely broke his fragile, entitled mind. He jumped up from his leather chair and started screaming at the top of his lungs. He pointed his finger at me and yelled that this company was his birthright. He cried that I was stealing his inheritance and that he was the true and rightful heir to the Vanguard legacy. He picked up a crystal water glass from the table and threw it across the room, letting it shatter violently against the far wall. His face was bright red, and he was sweating profusely, throwing a massive destructive tantrum like a spoiled child who just had his favorite toy taken away. I did not even blink. I just sat calmly in my chair, looked at Terrence, and gave him a single deliberate nod. Terrence picked up his phone and made a quick call to the building security desk down in the lobby. Less than a minute later, the heavy boardroom doors swung open. Two large security guards walked into the room with stern expressions. I smiled deeply as I recognized their faces. They were the exact same security guards DeAndre had ordered to escort me out of the building during his birthday gala just a few days ago. The head guard looked at me, waiting for instructions. I simply raised my hand and pointed at my screaming cousin. The guards moved swiftly and grabbed DeAndre by the lapels of his custom-tailored suit jacket. DeAndre thrashed and kicked, struggling against their grip. He screamed that his father was the chief executive officer and they had no right to touch him. The guards completely ignored his frantic protests. They dragged him forcefully out of the boardroom while he shouted bitter curses at me. Elijah did not even try to help his son. He just turned around and walked out of the room holding his head down, a completely broken and disgraced man. The reign of the golden child was officially over. 6 months passed since the boardroom massacre. I was sitting comfortably in the corner office on the top floor of the Vanguard Logistics Tower. The massive glass windows offered a sprawling, beautiful view of the Atlanta skyline. The heavy leather chair behind the mahogany desk was incredibly comfortable, and it belonged entirely to me. As the new chief executive officer, I had lifted the federal injunction and called off the freight strike the exact moment my uncle vacated the premises. The independent suppliers returned to work immediately out of loyalty to me, and our operational efficiency reached record-breaking highs by the end of the very first quarter. Vanguard stock not only recovered from the crash, but skyrocketed once the financial markets realized the true architect of the supply chain was finally running the show without any incompetent interference. The people who tried to destroy me were currently facing the absolute and devastating consequences of their own greed. Uncle Elijah was completely disgraced in the business community. The exorbitant legal fees required to fight the federal investigations and the numerous civil lawsuits filed by angry shareholders had completely drained his hidden offshore accounts. I was forced to sell his massive luxury estate in Buckhead and liquidate all his valuable assets just to keep himself out of total bankruptcy. I was living in a small, modest condo completely isolated from the elite social circles he used to dominate and terrorize. His former friends refused to return his calls. DeAndre was in far worse shape. The federal prosecutors did not offer him a lenient plea deal for the intellectual property theft. He was currently awaiting trial for corporate espionage and facing a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. He was entirely broke, unemployable, and universally despised throughout the logistics industry. The arrogant man who threw champagne on my shoes was now fighting just to keep his freedom. Sarah experienced a very similar and highly satisfying downfall. Her pristine country club lifestyle vanished into thin air the exact moment Malik served her those divorce papers in my uncle's foyer. She tried to fight viciously in court for spousal support, but the ironclad prenuptial agreement Terrence had helped Malik draft years ago left her with absolutely nothing. When the harsh reality of her new poverty set in, Sarah tried to come crawling back. She showed up crying hysterically in the lobby of Malik's new luxury high-rise apartment, begging for another chance. She claimed she was just overly stressed about finances when she insulted me and stole the flash drive. Malik did not even go down to the lobby to speak with her. He just called the concierge desk, told them to turn her away, and permanently blocked her phone number. He had finally realized his own massive worth and completely cut the toxic dead weight from his life. The heavy oak door to my office opened, and Malik walked in. He was wearing a sharp-tailored suit and carrying a digital tablet loaded with our updated financial projections. My younger brother was thriving as the newly appointed vice president of finance for the corporation. The constant fear and passivity that used to cloud his eyes were completely gone, replaced by a strong, unshakable confidence. He set the tablet on my desk and told me our quarterly profits had vastly exceeded all of the board expectations. We shared a quiet, warm smile of mutual respect and deep sibling solidarity. We had survived the toxic grip of our family and successfully built an empire on our own terms. Malik told me he had an important meeting with the international investors and headed out of the office, leaving me alone in the quiet, spacious room. I turned my comfortable chair around to look out at the bustling city below. My personal cell phone buzzed quietly on the desk. I picked it up and looked at the glowing screen. It was a text message from an unknown number. I knew immediately it was a prepaid burner phone. I opened the message and read the pathetic words written on the screen. It was DeAndre. He was begging me for a massive favor. I typed that his legal fees were drowning him, and he desperately needed money to keep his defense attorneys on retainer. He actually asked if I could find it in my heart to forgive the past and give him a low-level consulting job at Vanguard just to help him survive the month. He tried to play the emotional family card, telling me that we shared the same blood and needed to look out for each other when times got tough. I read the message twice, letting the sheer audacious hypocrisy of his request sink in. The golden child who told me I was nothing but a glorified dispatcher, who publicly humiliated me and deliberately tried to steal my lifework to save his own skin, was now begging me for scraps. I thought about the 12-year-old girl who used to cry herself to sleep, feeling like an unwanted burden in her uncle's massive house. I thought about the decades of unseen labor, the silent disrespect, and the constant feeling that I would never be enough for them. I typed my response with steady, deliberate fingers. I did not write a long paragraph explaining how much he had hurt me. I did not try to teach him a moral lesson or justify my feelings. I just gave him the exact same cold, dismissive advice he and my uncle had given me when I needed their support. I typed two simple words: try Uber. I hit send and watched the little green notification confirm the message was delivered. I placed the phone face down on my polished mahogany desk, took a deep breath, and turned my attention back to the global financial reports. The empire was finally mine, and there was still a lot of profitable work left to do. The biggest lesson I learned from watching my uncle's empire crumble is that your worth is not determined by the people who exploit your labor. For years, I believed I had to earn my family love by sacrificing my peace and carrying their burdens. But toxic family members will only value you for what they can extract from you. When you finally stop accepting their disrespect and establish firm boundaries, they will call you the villain. Let them. Real power comes from knowing your own genius, building your own table, and walking away from anyone who expects you to settle for scraps. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic family members who underestimated your worth, share your story in the comments below and hit that subscribe button for more journeys of reclaiming your power.